What if the broken-down supercar you stopped to help with turned out to belong to someone who could change your entire world? When a struggling single father with grease under his fingernails encounters a stranded woman beside $1 million McLaren, he has no idea that his simple act of kindness is about to unlock doors he never knew existed. This is a story about the unexpected connections that form when we choose compassion over convenience, and how sometimes the most extraordinary opportunities come disguised as ordinary moments of human decency. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the windshield of Marcus Chun's battered pickup truck as he navigated the winding mountain road that cut through the wealthy hills above Marin County. His 12-year-old daughter Sophie sat in the passenger seat, her math homework spread across her lap, occasionally glancing up at the storm clouds that seemed to be racing them down the mountainside. The radio crackled with weather warnings about flash flooding and reduced visibility, but Marcus kept driving. He had a job to finish. The call had come in just after 3 in the afternoon. Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who lived in one of the modest neighborhoods at the base of these hills, had a leaking water heater that was threatening to flood her basement. She couldn't afford to wait until Monday for a regular plumber, and Marcus never turned down emergency work, especially when it came from people who reminded him of his own grandmother. The fact that the job would take him through some of the most expensive real estate in Northern California was just an unfortunate coincidence. Marcus had been running his small handyman business for nearly 5 years now, ever since Sophie's mother had died in a car accident and left him scrambling to figure out how to be both father and provider. He was good with his hands, always. Had been. And word of mouth in their working-class neighborhood had kept them afloat. Barely. The truck needed new tires. Sophie was outgrowing her clothes faster than he could replace them, and the stack of bills on his kitchen counter seemed to multiply every time he looked away. But they were making it, one repair job at a time. Sophie looked up from her homework as they crested a particularly steep section of road. The houses here were different from their small apartment complex in San Rafael. These were estates, really. Sprawling properties with gates and circular driveways and landscaping that probably cost more than Marcus made in a year. She pressed her nose to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Dad, do you think people who live in houses like these ever fix their own stuff?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular mix of curiosity and skepticism that seemed to define 12-year-olds everywhere. Marcus glanced over at her, noting the way she was studying the mansions they passed. Sophie had always been observant, almost unnervingly so for someone her age. She noticed things that adults missed, remembered conversations that others forgot, and had a way of asking questions that cut straight to the heart of whatever was really going on. "I think everyone has something that needs fixing," he said, adjusting his grip on the steering wheel as they took another curve. "It's just that some people can afford to pay someone else to do it." "But you like fixing things yourself," Sophie pointed out. "Even when we could afford to hire someone, you'd rather figure it out on your own." It was true. Marcus had always been the type of person who preferred to understand how things worked rather than simply replacing them when they broke. It was a trait that had served him well in his current line of work, but it had also been a source of tension in his marriage. Sarah had wanted him to take a steady job with benefits and predictable hours, something that would give them security and allow them to plan for the future. Instead, he'd insisted on striking out on his own, convinced that he could build something meaningful with just his skills and determination. He'd been wrong about a lot of things, but not about his ability to solve problems with his hands. That much had kept them going when everything else fell apart. The storm intensified as they descended toward the valley, and Marcus was beginning to think they should have waited until morning when he saw the car. It was pulled over on the narrow shoulder of the road, hazard lights blinking weakly through the rain. At first glance, it looked like any other breakdown, the kind of scene that played out on highways across the country every day. But as they got closer, Marcus realized this wasn't just any car. It was a McLaren, sleek and low and impossibly orange, the kind of vehicle that belonged in magazines or on racetracks, not broken down on a mountain road in the middle of a rainstorm. The license plate read Velocity in elegant script, and even sitting still with its hood up, the car radiated an aura of speed and precision that made Marcus's practical pickup feel like a dinosaur by comparison. A woman stood beside the car, her phone pressed to her ear, gesturing with her free hand in what appeared to be an increasingly frustrated conversation. She was wearing a cream-colored business suit that was already showing signs of surrender to the weather, and her dark hair, which had probably started the day in some kind of professional arrangement, was now hanging in damp strands around her face. Even from a distance, Marcus could tell she was not having a good day. Sophie noticed the car at the same time he did. "Dad, is that a McLaren P1? Marcus looked at his daughter with surprise. "How do you know what kind of car that is?" "Tommy, Nguyen's older brother has all these car magazines," she explained, already unbuckling her seatbelt as Marcus pulled over behind the stranded vehicle. "He showed me pictures once. That car costs like $1 million. Then what's it doing broken down on the side of the road?" Marcus muttered, more to himself than to Sophie. He put the truck in park and reached for his jacket, though. He knew it wouldn't do much good against the rain that was now falling in sheets. "Are we going to help her?" Sophie asked, and there was something in her voice that suggested she already knew the answer. She'd watched her father stop for stranded motorists dozens of times over the years, regardless of what kind of car they were driving or whether they looked like they could afford to solve their own problems. "Of course we are," Marcus said, pulling on his jacket and grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. "Just because someone drives an expensive car doesn't mean they don't need help." They got out of the truck together, immediately soaked by the rain. As they approached the McLaren, Marcus could hear the woman's side of the phone conversation, and it was becoming clear that whoever she was talking to wasn't being particularly helpful. "No, I understand that it's Saturday evening," she was saying, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "What I don't understand is why a 24-hour service doesn't actually provide service 24 hours a day." She paused, listening, then continued. "Fine. How long for someone to get here?" Another pause. 3 hours? In this weather? Are you serious?" She hung up and stared at the phone for a moment, as if considering whether throwing it into the ravine beside the road would improve her situation. It was then that she noticed Marcus and Sophie standing a few feet away, rain dripping from their jackets. "Oh," she said, blinking in surprise. "I'm sorry, I didn't see you there." Up close, Marcus could see that she was probably in her early 30s with the kind of composed demeanor that suggested she was used to being in control of situations. But right now, standing beside a broken supercar in the middle of a storm, she looked about as helpless as anyone else would. "I'm Marcus," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the rain. "This is my daughter Sophie. We saw you were having trouble and thought we might be able to help." The woman looked from Marcus to Sophie and back again, as if trying to process the idea that strangers had stopped to offer assistance. "That's very kind of you," she said carefully, "but I'm not sure there's much anyone can do. The car just died. 1 minute everything was fine. The next minute it was like someone flipped a switch." Marcus nodded and moved closer to look under the hood. The McLaren's engine bay was a work of art, all carbon fiber and precision engineering. But engines were engines, and problems usually announced themselves in predictable ways. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He played his flashlight over the various components, looking for anything obvious. "Did it make any sounds before it stopped?" he asked. "Any warning lights?" "There was a sort of clicking noise," the woman said, moving to stand beside him. And then everything just went quiet. Sophie had been standing back, trying to stay out of the rain under a nearby tree, but now she moved closer to get a better look at the car. "This is so cool," she said, her voice full of genuine admiration. "I've never seen one of these up close before." The woman smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. "It's pretty special," she agreed. "Though right now it's mostly just expensive decoration." Marcus continued his examination of the engine, noting the way everything was laid out with almost surgical precision. This wasn't the kind of car you fixed with duct tape and determination. Every component had been designed to work in perfect harmony with every other component. And when something went wrong, it usually required specialized knowledge and expensive parts to set it right. But sometimes the most sophisticated machines failed for the simplest reasons. "Have you tried checking the battery connections?" he asked, tracing the main power cables with his flashlight. "The battery?" The woman sounded skeptical. "This car has more computer power than most offices. I don't think a dead battery would just make everything stop working." "Actually," Sophie chimed in really advanced cars, the computers control everything. If the main battery connection is loose, it's like unplugging the whole system." Both adults turned to look at her, and Sophie blushed slightly under their attention. "I mean, that's what I read in one of Tommy's magazines," she added quickly. Marcus found himself smiling despite the rain that was now soaking through his jacket. His daughter never ceased to amaze him with the things she absorbed from the world around her. He followed the battery cables to their connections and immediately saw the problem. "She's right," he said, pointing with his flashlight. "Look here, this connection is completely loose. Must have worked its way free from all the vibration." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small adjustable wrench, then carefully tightened the connection. The change was immediate. Dashboard lights flickered to life, and the car's various systems began their startup sequence with a soft electronic hum. The woman stared at him in disbelief. "That's it? That's all it was?" "Sometimes the simple problems disguise themselves as complicated ones," Marcus said, closing the hood and wiping his hands on his jeans. "You should be good to go now." She moved to the driver's side door and slid behind the wheel. The engine came to life with a deep, satisfying growl that even the rain couldn't muffle. For a moment, she just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, as if she couldn't quite believe that her problem had been solved so easily. Then she got out and walked back to where Marcus and Sophie were standing. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "I was looking at spending the night in that car, waiting for a tow truck that might not even be able to handle something like this." "Don't worry about it," Marcus said. Anyone would have done the same thing. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't entirely true. They'd passed at least 3 other cars on their way down the mountain, and none of them had stopped. People saw what they expected to see, and what most people expected when they saw a McLaren was someone who could afford to solve their own problems. The woman seemed to be thinking along the same lines. "Actually, I don't think many people would have stopped," she said. "And even fewer would have known what to do." She paused, looking from Marcus to Sophie. "I'm Victoria, by the way." "Victoria." "Chase." She extended her hand, and Marcus shook it, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested she was no stranger to work herself, despite the expensive car and designer suit. "Well, Victoria, it was nice meeting you," Marcus said. "But we should probably get going. I've got a job to finish before this storm gets any worse." Victoria nodded, but she seemed reluctant to let them leave. "Can I at least give you something for your trouble?" "Gas money, or—" "No need," Marcus said, already heading back toward his truck. "Just pay it forward sometime." As they walked away, Sophie looked back over her shoulder at Victoria, who was still standing beside her car in the rain. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think she wanted to give us money." "I know," Marcus replied, opening the passenger door for his daughter. "But that's not why we stopped." "But we could really use money," Sophie pointed out with the blunt honesty that only children possessed. Marcus paused with his hand on the door handle. She was right, of course. They could use money. They could use a lot of things that other people took for granted. But some things were worth more than money, and he'd been trying to teach Sophie that lesson for as long as he could remember. Yeah, we could, he agreed. But some things are more important than money. Like being the kind of person who helps when someone needs help, whether they can pay you back or not. Sophie considered this as she climbed into the truck. Is that why you always stop for people? Partly, Marcus said, starting the engine and checking his mirrors before pulling back onto the road. But also because you never know when you might be the one who needs help. And when that day comes, you hope there's someone like us willing to stop. In his rearview mirror, he could see Victoria still standing beside her car, watching them drive away. There was something about the way she was looking at them that stayed with him as they continued down the mountain toward Mrs. Rodriguez's house. It wasn't just gratitude, though that was certainly part of it. It was something more complicated, as if their brief encounter had surprised her in some fundamental way. The job at Mrs. Rodriguez's house turned out to be more involved than Marcus had expected. The water heater hadn't just sprung a leak. It was on the verge of complete failure, and replacing it in the middle of the storm while trying to prevent flood damage to the basement required all of his skill and patience. By the time he finished, it was nearly midnight, and both he and Sophie were exhausted. They drove home through empty streets, the storm having finally moved on to torment some other part of the Bay Area. Sophie had fallen asleep against the window, her math homework still spread across her lap, and Marcus found himself thinking about the woman they'd helped earlier that evening. There had been something about Victoria Chase that didn't quite add up. She'd been dressed like a successful businesswoman, driving a car that cost more than most people's houses, but there had been a quality to her surprise when he'd stopped to help that suggested genuine unfamiliarity with random kindness. It was as if she existed in a world where problems were solved with phone calls and credit cards, not with strangers who carried wrenches in their back pockets. Marcus had grown up in a world where neighbors helped neighbors, where community meant looking out for each other regardless of what anyone could afford to pay. It was a lesson his grandmother had taught him, and his father before her, and it was a lesson he was trying to pass on to Sophie. But he was beginning to realize that not everyone had grown up in such a world. When they finally reached their apartment complex, Marcus had to wake Sophie gently to get her upstairs. She mumbled something about McLarens and million-dollar engines as he helped her get ready for bed, but she was asleep again before he could ask her what she meant. Marcus sat at his kitchen table for a while after Sophie was settled, looking over the bills that never seemed to go away and trying to figure out how to make the numbers work for another month. The job at Mrs. Rodriguez's house had paid well, and there were 2 more scheduled for the following week, but it was always a balancing act between the money coming in and the money going out. He was just about to turn off the lights and head to bed when his phone rang. The number on the display was unfamiliar, and for a moment he considered letting it go to voicemail. But emergency calls came at all hours in his line of work, and he'd learned not to ignore his phone. "Hello?" he answered. "Marcus, this is Victoria Chase. We met earlier tonight on the mountain road." Marcus sat up straighter, suddenly wide awake. "Victoria, hi. Is everything okay? Is the car giving you trouble again?" No, the car is fine," she said quickly. "I'm sorry to call so late. I hope I didn't wake you." "Not at all," Marcus said, though he couldn't imagine why she would be calling. "What can I do for you?" There was a pause, as if Victoria was trying to figure out how to say whatever she wanted to say. "This is going to sound strange," she began, "but I was wondering if you might be interested in some work, paid work." Marcus felt his pulse quicken slightly. Work was always good, especially when it came from someone who could clearly afford to pay for quality results. "What kind of work?" "I have a collection," Victoria said. "Classic cars, mostly, but some modern ones too." I need someone who knows what they're doing to help with maintenance and repairs. Someone who understands that these aren't just transportation. They're investments, art pieces really. Marcus found himself leaning forward, despite the fact that Victoria couldn't see him. How big a collection are we talking about? Big enough that I need help, Victoria said, and he could hear something like amusement in her voice. Would you be interested in taking a look? I could pay you for your time, even if you decide it's not something you want to take on. Marcus thought about the bills on his table, about Sophie's outgrown clothes and the truck's bald tires. But he also thought about the way Victoria had looked at him and Sophie earlier that evening, as if their willingness to help had caught her completely off guard. When were you thinking? He asked. Tomorrow, if you're available. I know it's Sunday, but I could make it worth your while. Marcus almost laughed. Sunday was just another day when you ran your own business. Sure, he said. What time? How about 10 in the morning? I'll text you the address. After Victoria hung up, Marcus sat in his kitchen for a long time, staring at his phone and wondering what he'd just gotten himself into. He'd helped countless people over the years, but none of them had ever called him back with job offers. There was something about the whole situation that felt different, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly what. His phone buzzed with a text message containing an address in Sausalito, one of the most expensive zip codes in Marin County. Marcus looked it up on his Maps app and whistled softly when he saw the location. It was right on the water, in an area where houses routinely sold for tens of millions of dollars. Whatever Victoria Chase's car collection looked like, Marcus had a feeling it was going to be unlike anything he'd ever seen before. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the previous night's storm had been nothing more than a bad dream. Marcus made breakfast for Sophie, who was unusually quiet as she ate her cereal. You're thinking about something, he observed, sitting down across from her with his coffee. Sophie looked up from her bowl. The lady from last night. Victoria. She seemed different. Different how? I don't know exactly, Sophie said, frowning as she tried to put her thoughts into words. She was nice, but it was like she wasn't. Used to people being nice to her. Does that make sense? Marcus nodded. Sophie had picked up on the same thing he'd noticed. Some people live in worlds where everything has a price, he said, where kindness comes with expectations. But that's sad, Sophie said. It is, Marcus agreed. But maybe that's changing for her. Sophie's friend Emma's mother was picking her up for a sleepover that morning, which meant Marcus would be free to check out Victoria's mysterious car collection without having to worry about entertaining his daughter. As he got dressed, he found himself wondering what to expect. A few classic Mustangs in a garage, maybe a vintage Porsche or two. The address Victoria had given him led to a gated estate overlooking Richardson Bay, the kind of property that existed behind tall hedges and discreet security systems. Marcus pulled up to an imposing gate and pressed the call button, half expecting to be told he had the wrong address. Marcus? Victoria's voice came through the intercom, sounding genuinely pleased. Perfect timing. Come on up. The gate swung open silently, and Marcus drove up a winding driveway that curved through landscaped gardens toward a house that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. The main building was a masterpiece of glass and steel, designed to take advantage of the spectacular views while maintaining a sense of privacy and exclusion. But it wasn't the house that made Marcus stop his truck and stare in disbelief. It was what lay beyond it. What Victoria had modestly referred to as her collection was actually a complex of interconnected buildings that looked like they belonged at a world-class automotive museum. Through massive windows, Marcus could see rows of cars that represented decades of automotive evolution and artistry. There were classics he recognized from movies and magazines, modern supercars that he'd only dreamed of seeing in person, and vintage racing machines that belonged in history books. This wasn't just a car collection. This was automotive royalty. Victoria appeared at the main entrance to the complex, dressed in jeans and a simple sweater that somehow made her look both more approachable and more elegant than she had in her business suit. She walked toward his truck with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. "I hope you don't mind," she said as Marcus got out of his truck, "but I may have understated things a bit last night." Marcus looked around at the gleaming buildings, the pristine landscaping, the view that probably added several $1,000,000 to the property value all by itself. "You could say that," he managed. Victoria laughed, and the sound was surprisingly musical. "Would you like the tour?" As they walked toward the main building, Marcus found himself trying to process what he was seeing. This level of wealth was abstract to him, something that existed in magazines and news reports, but not in his real world. Yet here he was, about to get a guided tour from someone who apparently lived in this rarefied atmosphere. "I should probably explain," Victoria said as she led him through a side entrance. "What I told you last night was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I don't just collect cars. I run a business that deals in rare and exotic automobiles. Buying, selling, restoration, racing. It's called Chase Automotive, and we handle some of the most valuable cars in the world." They stepped into the main showroom, and Marcus had to stop walking just to take it all in. The space was enormous, with polished concrete floors and lighting that made every car look like it was posing for a magazine cover. There were vehicles here that he'd seen only in pictures. A 1961 Ferrari 250G Tez WB, a McLaren F1, a Lamborghini Miura, cars that represented the absolute pinnacle of automotive design and engineering. "This is incredible," Marcus said, and his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Thank you," Victoria said, and he could hear the pride in her voice. "I've been building this for almost 10 years now. Some of these cars are mine personally, but most of them belong to clients. We handle everything from routine maintenance to complete concours restorations." She led him deeper into the complex, past work bays where technicians in pristine uniforms were performing surgery on machines that cost more than most people's retirement savings. Everything was organized with military precision, and everyone Marcus saw seemed to know exactly what they were doing. "The thing is," Victoria continued, "we're growing faster than I can keep up with. I need someone who can handle the more complex mechanical work, someone who understands that these aren't just cars. They're pieces of history, works of art, investments that represent decades of someone's passion." Marcus nodded, though he was still trying to wrap his mind around the scale of the operation. "And you thought of me because I fixed your battery connection?" Victoria stopped walking and turned to face him. "I thought of you because of how you approached the problem. You didn't see an expensive car that was out of your league. You saw a machine that wasn't working properly, and you figured out how to fix it. That's exactly the kind of thinking I need here." She gestured toward a work bay where a pristine Porsche 911 was undergoing what appeared to be a complete engine rebuild. "Most of the people I've interviewed for this position have impressive resumes and extensive experience with exotic cars. But they all approach problems like they're following a script. They see a Porsche, so they apply Porsche solutions. They see a Ferrari, so they use Ferrari procedures." Marcus was beginning to understand. But sometimes a problem is just a problem, regardless of what badge is on the car. "Exactly," Victoria said, and her smile was radiant. "Last night, you didn't care that my car cost more than most people's houses. You just wanted to understand why it wasn't working and figure out how to fix it. That's the kind of practical intelligence that can't be taught." They continued the tour, and with each new area they visited, Marcus felt more overwhelmed and more intrigued. There was a climate-controlled storage facility where cars worth tens of millions of dollars sat in perfect silence, waiting for their owners to visit or for special events where they would be displayed like the masterpieces they were. There was a machine shop equipped with tools that could fabricate any part that couldn't be bought. no matter how obscure or expensive. And there was a racing division, where Victoria's company prepared cars for vintage racing events and modern track days. Marcus watched through a window as technicians fine-tuned a 1970s Formula, one car that looked like it could still compete at Monaco. "Do you race yourself?" Marcus asked as they paused to watch the work being done. "I do," Victoria said. "Started when I was 16, much to my parents' horror. They thought it was just a phase, but here we are 15 years later." She gestured toward a corner of the garage where several modern racing cars, wearing Chase Automotive livery, were parked. "We run a semi-professional team in several series. It's good advertising, and it keeps me connected to what these machines are really capable of." As they walked back toward the main office area, Marcus found himself thinking about the contrast between Victoria's world and his own. Everything here was precision and perfection, million-dollar problems solved with unlimited resources. His world was about making do with what you had, finding creative solutions when you couldn't afford the right parts, keeping things running through skill and determination rather than unlimited budgets. Yet somehow, Victoria thought his approach was what her business needed. "I have to ask," Marcus said as they settled into comfortable chairs in Victoria's office, which offered a panoramic view of the San Francisco Bay. "Why me? You obviously have access to the best technicians in the world. Why would you want to hire someone who mostly fixes leaky pipes and broken dishwashers?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, looking out at the water where sailboats were taking advantage of the perfect Sunday weather. "Can I tell you something that's going to sound completely crazy?" Marcus nodded. "I've been successful at this business because I understand cars, but also because I understand people. The clients who trust us with their million-dollar collections aren't just buying technical expertise. They're buying peace of mind. They want to know that someone cares about their cars the way they do." She turned back to face him. "Last night, when you stopped to help me, you didn't know who I was or what I could afford. You just saw someone who needed help, and you provided it. No questions, no expectations, no agenda. That's exactly the kind of integrity I want representing my company." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. He'd spent the last 5 years scrambling to keep his small business afloat, always one emergency away from financial disaster, always worried about whether he could provide Sophie with the life she deserved. The idea that someone might value his work enough to offer him real stability was almost too much to process. "What exactly would the job involve?" he asked. Victoria pulled out a folder from her desk and handed it to him. "Lead technician position. You'd oversee the mechanical side of our restoration and maintenance operations, work directly with clients on their most valuable projects, and help train the rest of the team. The salary would be competitive with what the best automotive technicians make anywhere in the country." Marcus opened the folder and looked at the number written on the first page. It was more than competitive. It was life-changing. It was the kind of money that would mean Sophie could have everything she needed and most of what she wanted. It was the kind of security that would let him sleep at night without worrying about the next repair bill or unexpected expense. But it was also the kind of opportunity that seemed too good to be true. "I'd need to think about it," Marcus said carefully. "This is a big decision." "Of course," Victoria said. "Take all the time you need. But I hope you'll seriously consider it. I think you'd be surprised by how much you'd enjoy working with these machines. They're puzzles, really, and you strike me as someone who likes solving puzzles." As Marcus drove home that afternoon, his mind was spinning with everything he'd seen and heard. Victoria's offer represented everything he'd been working toward. For the past 5 years, financial security, meaningful work, the chance to provide Sophie with opportunities he'd never dreamed of. But it also represented a leap into a world he didn't fully understand, working with cars that cost more than he'd earn in a lifetime, surrounded by people whose idea of normal was completely different from his own. When he picked up Sophie from Her sleepover that evening, she immediately noticed that something had changed. "You look different," she said as they drove home. "Good different. Like when you figure out a really hard problem." Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "How would you feel about moving to a different kind of life?" he asked. "Somewhere nicer, maybe. Better schools, more opportunities." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to most important questions. "Would we still be us?" she asked finally. "What do you mean?" "Would we still help people who need help? Would we still be the kind of people who stop when someone's car breaks down?" Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. Sometimes his daughter's wisdom caught him completely off guard. "Yeah," he said softly, "we'd still be us." "Then I think it sounds good," Sophie said. "As long as we don't forget where we came from." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Marcus sat on his small balcony and looked out at the lights of San Rafael. Somewhere across the bay, Victoria Chase was probably in her glass house overlooking the water, surrounded by cars worth more than small country's GDP. Tomorrow he would have to decide whether to step into her world or stay in his own. But tonight, for just a little while longer, he could imagine what it might be like to have problems that money could solve and dreams that actually seemed achievable. His phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "I forgot to mention. We have excellent health insurance and a college fund program for employees' children. Just thought you should know. No pressure, but the offer stands as long as you need it to." Marcus stared at the message for a long time. College fund, health insurance, the kinds of things that other parents took for granted, but that had been distant dreams for him and Sophie. Maybe some opportunities really were too good to pass up. Maybe it was time to find out what lay beyond the world he'd always known. The Monday morning fog hung low over San Francisco Bay as Marcus drove toward Sausalito, his toolbox rattling softly in the bed of his pickup truck. He'd made his decision over coffee and toast while Sophie got ready for school, watching her methodically organize her backpack with the same careful attention to detail that she brought to everything in her life. When she'd asked if today was the day he was going to start his new adventure, he'd realized that the choice had been made somewhere in the space between Victoria's text message and his daughter's unwavering faith in his ability to handle whatever came next. The security gate recognized his truck this time, swinging open before he could announce himself. As he drove up the winding driveway, Marcus noticed details he'd missed during his first visit. The landscaping wasn't just expensive. It was artful, with native plants arranged in patterns that complemented the natural contours of the hillside. Solar panels were discreetly integrated into the roof lines of the various buildings, and he caught a glimpse of what looked like a sophisticated water reclamation system hidden among the gardens. Victoria met him at the main entrance to the workshop complex, dressed in dark jeans and a Chase Automotive polo shirt that somehow managed to look both professional and approachable. Her hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and Marcus noticed that she wore a simple watch rather than the kind of jewelry he might have expected from someone in her position. "Ready for your first day?" she asked, extending a steaming cup of coffee that smelled significantly better than anything Marcus usually drank. "As ready as I can be," Marcus replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "Though I have to admit, I'm still not entirely sure what I've gotten myself into." Victoria's laugh was warm and genuine. "Neither am I, honestly. That's what makes it interesting." She led him through the main workshop area, which was already humming with quiet activity. Despite the early hour, Marcus counted at least a dozen technicians working on various projects, from a complete engine rebuild on what appeared to be a 1960s Ferrari to delicate bodywork on a modern Lamborghini that looked like it had recently had an unfortunate encounter with a concrete barrier. "Everyone starts work at 7, Victoria explained as they walked. "We find that the early hours are best for the kind of precision work these cars require. Fewer distractions, better focus, and it gives us time for thorough quality control before clients start arriving for appointments." Marcus nodded, noting the way the technicians moved around their workstations with practiced efficiency. Each bay was equipped with tools that probably cost more than most people's cars, and every surface was spotlessly clean. This wasn't just a workplace. It was a temple dedicated to automotive perfection. "Your office is over here," Victoria said, leading him toward a glass-walled space that overlooked the main workshop floor. "I thought you'd want to be able to see everything that's happening while still having a quiet place to handle paperwork and client consultations." The office was surprisingly modest, furnished with a sturdy desk, comfortable chairs, and walls lined with technical manuals and automotive reference books. A large window offered a view of the bay, but the positioning made it clear that the primary focus was meant to be on the workshop activity below. "This is perfect," Marcus said, settling into the desk chair and immediately feeling a sense of rightness about the space. He could imagine spending his days here, solving problems and working with his hands while still being able to oversee the broader operation. Victoria pulled up a chair and opened a tablet that appeared to contain detailed information about every project currently in progress. "I thought we'd start with a walkthrough of our current workload," she said. "Then I'll introduce you to the team leaders and we can figure out where your skills will be most valuable." For the next 2 hours, Marcus received an education in the kind of automotive work he'd never imagined existed. There were cars here that belonged in museums, vehicles so rare that their owners flew in from other countries just to observe routine maintenance procedures. A 1957 Ferrari Testarossa that was being prepared for the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. A McLaren F1 that needed its entire electrical system diagnosed after a previous shop had created more problems than they'd solved. A Porsche 917 that was being restored to exactly the specification it had worn when it won Le Mans in 1970. Each project required not just technical expertise, but historical knowledge, an understanding of provenance and authenticity that went far beyond simple mechanical skill. The clients weren't just buying repairs. They were investing in the preservation of automotive history. "The thing that surprised me most when I started this business," Victoria said as they paused beside a partially disassembled Jaguar E-Type, "was how much detective work is involved. Half the time, we're not just fixing problems. We're figuring out what previous owners or shops have done to these cars over the years. Some modifications are obvious, but others are subtle enough that they can fool experts." Marcus examined the Jaguar's engine bay, noting several components that didn't look quite right for the car's supposed vintage. "Like this air cleaner assembly," he said, pointing to a part that was clearly from a later model. "Someone swapped it at some point, probably because the original was damaged or missing." "Exactly," Victoria said, and Marcus caught a note of excitement in her voice. "Most people would install whatever fits and call it good. But this car is going to a collector who's paying for authenticity. That means we need to source the correct part, even if it takes months to find one." The morning continued with introductions to the various team leaders and specialists who kept the operation running smoothly. There was Rodriguez, the paint specialist who could match colors that hadn't been used by manufacturers in decades. Chun, the electronics expert who specialized in the increasingly complex computer systems found in modern supercars. Martinez, the upholstery craftsman who could recreate interior details using techniques that were rapidly becoming lost arts. Each person Marcus met seemed genuinely passionate about their work, and more importantly, they seemed genuinely interested in having him join the team. There was none of the territorial behavior or resistance to change that he'd expected in such a specialized environment. "The thing about working with cars like these," Rodriguez explained as he demonstrated the painstaking process of color matching the paint sample, "is that you can't fake expertise. These machines are too sophisticated, too valuable, and too visible. Either you know what you're doing or you don't, and it becomes obvious pretty quickly which category you fall into." By lunchtime, Marcus felt like he'd been drinking from a fire hose for 4 straight hours. The depth and complexity of the work being done here was overwhelming, but it was also exactly the kind of challenge he'd been craving without realizing it. Every problem was unique, every solution required creativity and precision, and the stakes were high enough to make every success meaningful. Victoria took him to lunch at a small cafe in downtown Sausalito, a deliberately casual choice. That allowed them to talk without the distraction of the workshop environment. They sat at a table overlooking the harbor, watching sailboats navigate the afternoon breeze while they discussed the practical aspects of Marcus's transition into his new role. "I want to be honest with you about something," Victoria said after they'd ordered. "When I decided to expand our operations, I interviewed more than 20 candidates for this position. Most of them had impressive credentials. Advanced degrees, experience at exotic car dealerships, certifications from manufacturers that most people have never heard of." Marcus waited, sensing that there was more to this story. "But none of them understood what we really do here," Victoria continued. "They saw expensive cars and assumed that meant expensive solutions to every problem. They thought complexity required complexity, that sophisticated machines demanded sophisticated approaches to every issue." She paused to take a sip of her iced tea. "What you showed me on Saturday night was exactly the opposite philosophy. You saw a problem, you diagnosed it systematically, and you applied the simplest solution that would actually work. That's the kind of thinking that makes the difference between a good technician and a great one." Marcus found himself thinking about his father, who had taught him to approach every problem with patience and logic rather than assumptions and expensive tools. "My dad always said that the best mechanics are the ones who can make anything work with whatever they have available," he said. He used to joke that if you couldn't fix it with duct tape and determination, it probably wasn't worth fixing. Victoria laughed. "I have a feeling your father would appreciate some of the creative solutions we've had to come up with over the years. We once had to fabricate a replacement part for a 1930s Bugatti using measurements taken from photographs because no original examples existed anywhere in the world." The conversation shifted to more practical matters as they discussed Marcus's start date, his schedule, and the logistics of transitioning his existing clients to other contractors. Victoria had already thought through most of the details, offering to help with referrals and even to cover any lost income during the transition period. "I don't want you to worry about the financial aspects," she said. "This is an investment in the future of our business, and I want to make sure you can focus on learning and growing without any external pressure." As they drove back to the workshop, Marcus found himself thinking about how different his life was about to become. No more emergency calls at midnight, no more wondering whether he'd have enough work to pay the bills, no more explaining to Sophie why they couldn't afford things that other families took for granted. But he also realized that he was going to miss certain aspects of his old life. The variety of problems he encountered, the direct relationships with clients who genuinely needed his help, the satisfaction of solving problems with creativity rather than unlimited resources. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said as they pulled into the Chase Automotive Complex. "Of course. Do you ever miss the simplicity of working on regular cars? The kind of problems that don't require historical research and million-dollar solutions?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Actually, yes," she said finally. "Sometimes I miss the days when I could spend a weekend in my garage working on a project car just for the joy of making something work better than it did before. There's something pure about that kind of work that gets lost when everything becomes about provenance and investment value." She parked near the main entrance and turned to face him. "But I've found that the key is remembering why I fell in love with cars in the first place. It wasn't because they were expensive or rare or prestigious. It was because they were these amazing machines that could be understood and improved through skill and determination." That afternoon, Victoria introduced Marcus to his first major project. A client had brought in a 1973 Porsche Carrera RS that had been sitting in storage for nearly 20 years. The car was essentially original and extremely valuable, but decades of inactivity had created a host of problems that needed to be addressed before it could be safely driven again. "The client wants a complete mechanical recommissioning," Victoria explained as they examined the car in one of the climate-controlled work bays. "But he's also very concerned about maintaining the car's originality. Every component that we remove or replace needs to be documented, and any modifications need to be completely reversible." Marcus walked around the Porsche slowly, noting the way dust had settled into every crease and corner, but also recognizing the fundamental soundness of the machine underneath. This was exactly the kind of project he dreamed of working on, a chance to bring a sleeping giant back to life through careful attention and skilled craftsmanship. "What's the timeline?" he asked. "The client would like to have it ready for a vintage racing event in 3 months, Victoria said. "But he's more interested in having the work done properly than having it done quickly. This car will probably appreciate more in the next 10 years than most people make in salary, so getting it right is more important than getting it done fast." Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon creating a detailed inspection checklist and developing a work plan for the Porsche restoration. It was methodical, satisfying work that required him to draw on everything he'd learned about automotive systems while also considering factors he'd never had to think about before. Every decision had to be weighed against the car's historical significance and investment value. Should they rebuild the original engine or source a replacement? Were aftermarket parts acceptable if they improved reliability, or did authenticity trump performance? How much of the car's patina and wear should be preserved as evidence of its history? These weren't just mechanical questions. They were philosophical, ones that required an understanding of what made these cars valuable beyond their ability to transport people from one place to another. As the day wound down, Marcus found himself working alongside Rodriguez to develop a paint preservation strategy for the Porsche's original finish. The car's guard's red paint had faded and developed a patina over the years, but it was still fundamentally sound and historically significant. "The temptation is always to make everything look new again," Rodriguez explained as he examined the paint under different lighting conditions. "But collectors are becoming more sophisticated about originality. Sometimes a car is worth more with its original paint, even if that paint isn't perfect, than it would be with a flawless but non-original finish." Marcus nodded, beginning to understand the complexity of decisions that had to be made on every project. In his previous work, the goal had always been straightforward: make it work as well as possible with the resources available. Here, the goal was more nuanced: preserve the car's essential character while ensuring that it could fulfill its intended purpose. By 6 o'clock, most of the workshop team had gone home, but Marcus found himself reluctant to leave. There was something addictive about being surrounded by these incredible machines, each one representing decades of engineering evolution and human passion. He'd spent his entire adult life working with his hands, but this felt different. This felt like art. Victoria appeared at his workstation carrying 2 bottles of beer and looking amused by his obvious reluctance to call it a day. "First day enthusiasm is a good sign," she said, handing him one of the bottles. "But pace yourself. These projects have a way of consuming every available hour if you let them." They sat on stools beside the Porsche, sipping their beer and watching the last light of day fade over the bay. The workshop was quiet now except for the soft hum of climate control systems and the distant sound of traffic on Highway 101. "Can I ask you something personal?" Marcus said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. Victoria nodded. "How did you end up in this business? I mean, I can see that you love cars, but this level of operation requires serious capital and business expertise. That doesn't usually happen by accident." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, rotating her beer bottle slowly between her hands. "My father owned a small auto repair shop when I was growing up," she said finally. "Nothing fancy, just a neighborhood place that kept people's daily drivers running. I used to spend every afternoon there after school, and he taught me everything he knew about how cars worked." She paused, lost in memory. "When I was 16, a customer brought in this beat-up 1967 Mustang that had been sitting in a barn for years. My father was going to tell him it wasn't worth fixing, but I convinced him to let me work on it as a project. It took me 8 months, working every weekend and holiday, but I got that car running again." Marcus could picture it. A teenage Victoria covered in grease and determination, refusing to give up on a machine that everyone else had written off. "The day we fired it up for the first time," Victoria continued, "I knew that I wanted to spend my life bringing dead cars back to life, but I also realized that if I was going to do it right, I needed to understand the business side as well as the technical side." She took a sip of her beer. "So I went to business school, worked for a few years in investment banking, and saved every penny I could. When I finally had enough capital to start this business, I knew exactly what I wanted to build." Marcus found himself impressed not just by Victoria's success, but by the thoughtful way she'd planned and executed her vision. This wasn't someone who had stumbled into wealth. This was someone who had worked systematically toward a specific goal. "What happened to your father's shop?" he asked. Victoria's expression grew sad. "He sold it a few years after I graduated. College," said the business was changing too fast for him to keep up. Most of his customers were driving newer cars that needed computer diagnostics rather than mechanical intuition. He felt like he was becoming obsolete. Marcus nodded, understanding the feeling. The automotive world was changing rapidly, with traditional mechanical skills becoming less relevant as cars became more computerized and manufacturers made them increasingly difficult to service independently. "That's part of why this business model works," Victoria continued. "Classic and exotic cars still need traditional craftsmanship. They need people who understand how machines work at a fundamental level, not just how to follow diagnostic procedures." As they finished their beer and prepared to lock up the workshop, Marcus found himself thinking about the parallel between Victoria's story and his own. Both of them had learned to work with their hands from their fathers. Both had struggled to find their place in a changing world. And both had ultimately found success by combining traditional skills with modern business understanding. The drive home to San Rafael felt different than it had that morning. Marcus was no longer commuting from his old life to a potential new one. He was returning home from his first day at a job that felt like it had been designed specifically for his skills and interests. Sophie was waiting for him with homework spread across the kitchen table and a dozen questions about his day. As he described the cars he'd seen and the people he'd met, Marcus watched his daughter's eyes grow wide with excitement. "So you're really going to work on million-dollar cars every day?" she asked. "Some of them are worth even more than that," Marcus said. "But the important thing isn't how much they cost. It's how interesting the problems are and how much I'm going to learn." Sophie nodded seriously. "And we'll be able to afford things now? Like a better apartment and maybe a car that doesn't make that weird noise when you start it?" Marcus laughed. "Yeah, kiddo, we'll be able to afford things. But let's not go crazy all at once." That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Marcus sat on their small balcony and called his father in Sacramento. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing that his dad would have mixed feelings about his son leaving the independent contractor world for a corporate position. "You're sure this is what you want?" his father asked after Marcus had explained the opportunity. Working for someone else, dealing with rich people's toys instead of helping regular folks with real problems? Marcus had expected this reaction. His father had always been suspicious of wealth, and the people who possessed it, convinced that money corrupted people's values and distorted their priorities. "I think it's more complicated than that, Dad," Marcus said. "These aren't just toys. They're pieces of history, works of art. And the woman who owns the business, she's not what you'd expect. She understands cars the way you taught me to understand them." His father was quiet for a long moment. "Well," he said finally, "you've always had good judgment about people. And God knows you and Sophie deserve some security after everything you've been through." After hanging up, Marcus sat in the darkness for a while, thinking about the conversation and what it represented. His father's skepticism wasn't entirely wrong. There was something unsettling about the vast disparity between the world he was entering and the world he was leaving behind. But there was also something hopeful about the possibility that expertise and integrity could be valued regardless of their context. Victoria had offered him this opportunity not because he fit into her world, but because his skills and values were exactly what her business needed. His phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Hope your first day was everything you expected and more. Looking forward to seeing what you accomplish with the Porsche. By the way, there's a Cars and Coffee event this Saturday in Palo Alto. Thought you and Sophie might enjoy seeing some of our cars in action if you're interested." Marcus smiled as he typed his response. "We'd love to come. Thanks for thinking of us." As he headed inside to get ready for bed, Marcus realized that he was genuinely excited about going to work tomorrow. It had been years since he'd felt that way about anything, and the sensation was both unfamiliar and deeply satisfying. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the future felt full of possibilities rather than obstacles. And while he knew that every opportunity came with its own challenges, he was confident that he and Sophie were ready for whatever came next. The Tuesday morning fog was just beginning to lift as Marcus pulled into the Chase Automotive Complex for his second day. He'd arrived 15 minutes early, partly out of enthusiasm and partly because he'd discovered that the commute from San Rafael was actually easier than most of his old service calls had been. Victoria was already in the workshop, standing beside the Porsche with a clipboard and wearing the kind of focused expression that suggested she'd been there for a while. She looked up as Marcus approached, and her smile was warm but businesslike. "Perfect timing," she said. "I've been thinking about our approach to the Carrera RS project, and I want to run something by you before we get started." She led him to a conference room that Marcus hadn't seen during his previous visit, a space that clearly served as both a client consultation area and a project planning center. The walls were covered with photographs of completed restorations, technical diagrams, and awards from various automotive organizations. "I had a call from the client last night," Victoria said as they settled into chairs around a polished table. "He's been doing some research on the car's history, and it turns out this particular Porsche has more significance than we initially realized." Marcus waited, sensing that this development was going to complicate their approach to the restoration. It was originally owned by a fairly successful amateur racer in the 1970s, Victoria continued. The client found documentation showing that it competed in several important events, including a class win at Laguna Seca in 1975. That changes our priorities significantly. Marcus began to understand the implications. A car with genuine racing history was worth considerably more than one that had simply been driven on weekends, but it also meant that any evidence of that history needed to be preserved and documented. "So we're not just restoring a car," Marcus said. "We're preserving a piece of racing history." "Exactly," Victoria said. "Which means our approach needs to be more archaeological than automotive. Every component we remove needs to be examined for evidence of period modifications or wear patterns that might tell us something about how the car was used." They spent the next hour developing a revised strategy that would allow them to document every aspect of the car's condition before beginning any work. It was a meticulous process, that would add time and complexity to the project. But Marcus found himself energized by the intellectual challenge it represented. "Have you ever worked on a car with this kind of provenance before?" Victoria asked, as they prepared to return to the workshop. "Not exactly," Marcus admitted. "But I once restored a 1969 Camaro that had been drag raced in the 1970s. The owner had all the old-time slips and photographs, and we were able to recreate the exact configuration it had when it was competing. There's something special about bringing those old warriors back to life." Victoria nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly the right attitude. These cars weren't built to sit in climate-controlled garages being admired. They were built to be driven, and driven hard. Our job is to make sure they can fulfill that purpose again while respecting their history." The morning was spent creating a photographic record of every detail of the Porsche's current condition. Marcus worked methodically, documenting not just the obvious components, but also the subtle wear patterns, modifications, and imperfections that told the story of the car's life. It was painstaking work that required patience and attention to detail, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way that Marcus hadn't expected. He was learning to read the car like a historian might read an ancient manuscript, finding meaning in details that most people would overlook. Rodriguez joined them for the inspection, bringing his expertise in paint and bodywork to the documentation process. Together, they discovered evidence of period racing modifications that had been carefully hidden by previous owners who had tried to return the car to its original street configuration. "Look at this," Rodriguez said, pointing to an area near the rear spoiler where the paint was slightly different. "Someone filled holes here, probably where additional aerodynamic pieces were mounted. And these scratches on the door frames suggest that the car had a roll cage at some point." Marcus examined the areas Rodriguez had identified, beginning to piece together a picture of the car's racing career. "The owner must have converted it back to street trim after he stopped competing," he said. "But he kept all the performance modifications hidden underneath." Victoria was taking notes and photographs as they worked, building a comprehensive record that would be valuable both for the restoration and for the car's future provenance. "This is exactly why authentication is so important," she said. "Without this kind of detective work, we might never know that this car had such an interesting history." By lunchtime, they had completed the initial documentation and were ready to begin the actual mechanical work. Marcus felt a familiar excitement as he prepared to dig into the car's systems, but it was tempered by an awareness of the responsibility he was taking on. This wasn't just someone's weekend toy or daily driver. This was a piece of automotive history that would outlive everyone currently working on it, and the decisions they made would affect how future generations understood and appreciated the car. "Nervous?" Victoria asked as they prepared to remove the engine for inspection. "A little," Marcus admitted, "but in a good way. This is the kind of project I used to dream about working on." The engine removal went smoothly, revealing a power plant that was fundamentally sound but showed clear evidence of the kind of hard use that racing cars experienced. The cylinder heads had been professionally ported, the pistons were racing specification pieces, and the entire bottom end had been balanced and blueprinted to competition standards. "Someone spent serious money on this engine," Marcus observed as they examined the components. "This isn't just a mild performance upgrade. This is a full race motor." Victoria nodded, making notes on her tablet. "Which explains why the car was competitive in period. The owner wasn't just playing around. He was serious about going fast." They spent the afternoon carefully disassembling and inspecting every component of the engine, documenting modifications and assessing what would need to be rebuilt or replaced. It was methodical work that required both technical knowledge and historical understanding, exactly the kind of challenge that Marcus had been hoping to find. As the day progressed, Marcus became increasingly aware of the collaborative nature of the work at Chase Automotive. Unlike his previous experience as an independent contractor, where he had been responsible for every aspect of every project, here he was part of a team of specialists who each brought unique expertise to complex problems. Chun joined them to examine the car's electrical system, immediately identifying several period modifications that had been made to support racing equipment. Martinez was consulted about the car's interior, which showed evidence of having once been fitted with racing seats and safety equipment. "This is how restoration should work," Victoria explained as they gathered around the disassembled Porsche. Every specialist contributing their knowledge to create a complete understanding of what we're dealing with. No one person can be an expert in every aspect of these cars, but together we can handle anything. Marcus found himself thinking about the contrast between this collaborative approach and his previous work. As an independent contractor, he had often been forced to make educated guesses about problems that were outside his areas of expertise. Here, he could focus on what he did best while relying on genuine experts to handle everything else. The afternoon concluded with a planning session where the team developed a comprehensive restoration strategy based on their findings. Every component would be restored to its racing specification while maintaining the appearance of a street car, preserving both the car's performance heritage and its current configuration. "The timeline is going to be longer than we initially estimated," Victoria told Marcus as they reviewed the plan. "But the client will be thrilled with what we've discovered. This car is going to be worth significantly more than he thought when we're finished." As Marcus prepared to leave for the day, he realized that he was already thinking about tomorrow's work with anticipation rather than obligation. The intellectual challenges, the collaborative environment, and the satisfaction of working on truly exceptional machines were everything he had hoped for when he decided to accept Victoria's offer. The drive home gave him time to process everything he was learning, not just about exotic car restoration, but about what it meant to work at the highest levels of any craft. The attention to detail, the commitment to historical accuracy, and the willingness to invest whatever time was necessary to achieve perfection were all lessons that extended far beyond automotive work. Sophie was waiting for him with her homework finished and dinner already started, a responsibility she had taken on with characteristic seriousness now that her father's schedule was more predictable. "How was day 2? She asked as they sat down to eat. "Even better than day 1, Marcus said. "We're working on this Porsche that has an amazing history. It was a race car in the 1970s, and we're bringing it back to exactly the way it was when it was winning races." Sophie's eyes lit up with interest. "Are you going to get to drive it when it's finished?" Marcus laughed. "I doubt it. Cars like this are worth too much money to let mechanics take them for joyrides. But just being able to work on it is pretty incredible." That evening, Marcus called Mrs. Rodriguez to check on her water heater and to let her know that he had referred her to another contractor for any future needs. The conversation was bittersweet. She had been one of his first clients when he started his business, and he genuinely cared about her well-being. "You're sure this new job is going to work out?" she asked with the concern of someone who had watched him struggle through the early years of single parenthood. "I'm sure," Marcus said. "It's exactly the kind of work I've always wanted to do. And it's going to give Sophie and me the security we've never had." After hanging up, Marcus spent some time updating his business records and officially transitioning his remaining clients to other contractors. It was the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another, and while he felt some nostalgia for the independence and variety of his old work, he had no doubts about the decision he had made. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Great work today. The client is going to be amazed when he sees what we've discovered about his car's history. Looking forward to seeing how this project develops." Marcus smiled as he read the message. It felt good to be working with someone who appreciated both the technical and historical aspects of what they were doing, someone who understood that Restoration was as much about preserving stories as it was about rebuilding machines. As he got ready for bed, Marcus found himself thinking about the Saturday cars and coffee event that Victoria had mentioned. It would be Sophie's first exposure to the world of high-end automotive culture, and he was curious to see how she would react to it. More importantly, it would be their first social interaction with Victoria outside the professional context of the workshop. Marcus was beginning to realize that his feelings about his new employer were more complex than simple professional respect, and he wasn't entirely sure how to navigate that complexity. But those were concerns for another day. Tonight he was content to fall asleep thinking about Porsche engines and racing history, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to learn. For the first time in years, Marcus Chun was exactly where he wanted to be. The Saturday morning air carried the scent of coffee and gasoline as Marcus and Sophie arrived at the Cars and Coffee gathering in Palo Alto. What had started as a casual monthly meet for automotive enthusiasts had evolved into one of the most prestigious car shows on the West Coast, drawing collectors and their prized machines from across Northern California. Sophie pressed her face to the passenger window as they entered the parking lot, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to take in everything at once. The display was overwhelming, even for someone who had spent the week surrounded by exotic machinery. Ferraris lined up next to Lamborghinis, vintage Porsches shared space with modern McLarens, and scattered throughout were automotive unicorns that existed in quantities measured in dozens rather than thousands. "Dad, is that a Bugatti?" Sophie asked, pointing toward a sleek black and silver machine that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Marcus followed her gaze and felt his breath catch. "That's a Veyron," he said softly. "There are probably only a few hundred of those in the entire world." They parked Marcus's pickup truck in the designated area for spectators, a practical section that felt like a different planet compared to the main display area. As they walked toward the exotic car section, Marcus became acutely aware of the difference between his work clothes and the casual but expensive attire worn by most of the other attendees. Victoria appeared before his self-consciousness could fully develop, walking toward them with a genuine smile and carrying 2 cups of what smelled like significantly better coffee than the usual event fare. She was dressed in jeans and a vintage racing t-shirt that somehow managed to look both effortless and perfectly chosen. "You made it," she said, handing Marcus one of the cups. "Sophie, I'm so glad you could come. I have something special I want to show you." She led them through the crowd toward a section where several chase automotive vehicles were displayed. Marcus immediately recognized the McLaren P1 they had worked on earlier in the week, now gleaming under the California sun and surrounded by admirers who spoke in hushed, reverent tones. But it was the car next to it that made Sophie gasp audibly. A 1973 Porsche Carrera RS in classic white with green stripes, identical to the one currently disassembled in their workshop, sat gleaming like a jewel among the other displayed vehicles. "Is that our car?" Sophie asked, her voice filled with wonder. Victoria laughed. "Not exactly, but it's the same model and year. I thought you might like to see what your dad's project is going to look like when it's finished." Marcus walked around the Porsche slowly, noting the subtle details that distinguished a properly restored example from one that had simply been made to look good. The paint had the deep, lustrous quality that only came from countless hours of careful preparation. The brightwork was perfectly polished, but showed the appropriate amount of wear for a car of this vintage. Most importantly, the overall presence was exactly right, capturing the aggressive elegance that had made the Carrera RS legendary. "The owner is here somewhere," Victoria said, scanning the crowd. "I'd like you to meet him. He's the kind of client who really understands what we do." A few minutes later, Victoria introduced Marcus and Sophie to James Morrison, a retired aerospace engineer who had spent the last 15 years assembling one of the most respected Porsche collections on the West Coast. He was a compact man, in his 70s with intelligent eyes and hands that showed evidence of someone who had worked with precision machinery his entire life. "So you're the new technical director at Chase," Morrison said, shaking Marcus's hand with a firm grip. "Victoria tells me you have an interesting background." Marcus found himself slightly intimidated by Morrison's obvious expertise and the casual way he referred to cars worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. "I'm still learning," he said. "This is all pretty new to me." Morrison's expression grew more interested rather than dismissive. "The best technicians I've known were the ones who approached every car like they had something new to teach them. Tell me, what do you think of this particular example?" Marcus examined the Porsche more carefully, drawing on everything he had learned during the week about reading the subtle signs that distinguished exceptional restorations from merely good ones. The more he looked, the more impressed he became with the attention to detail and historical accuracy. "It's remarkable," he said finally. "Whoever restored this understood that perfection isn't just about making everything look new. It's about making everything look exactly as it should for this specific car at this specific point in its life." Morrison's face broke into a genuine smile. "That's exactly right. This car took 3 years to restore, and we spent almost as much time researching its history as we did actually working on it. Would you like to hear the story?" For the next 20 minutes, Morrison regaled them with the tale of tracking down the car's original owner, locating period-correct replacement parts, and uncovering documentation that revealed the car's participation in several important racing events. It was detective work as much as restoration, requiring patience, persistence, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Sophie listened with rapt attention, asking questions that demonstrated her growing understanding of what made these cars special. Marcus found himself impressed not just by Morrison's knowledge, but by his obvious passion for the historical and cultural significance of the machines he collected. "The thing most people don't understand," Morrison said, "is that these cars are time machines. When you drive a properly restored example, you're experiencing exactly what someone felt 40 or 50 years ago. That's worth preserving." As they continued to explore the event, Marcus began to understand the culture that surrounded high-end automotive collecting. It wasn't just about wealth or status, though those elements were certainly present. For the serious collectors, it was about preserving mechanical art and automotive history for future generations. Victoria introduced them to other collectors and enthusiasts, and Marcus was struck by how many of them had technical backgrounds or had developed genuine expertise in their areas of interest. These weren't casual hobbyists. They were people who had devoted significant portions of their lives to understanding and preserving automotive culture. "I want to show you something," Victoria said as they approached a section of the display that seemed to be drawing particularly intense attention from the crowd. In the center of a cleared area sat a car that Marcus immediately recognized as something extraordinary, even though he couldn't immediately identify what it was. The vehicle was clearly from the 1960s, with flowing lines and an aggressive stance that suggested serious performance capability. But there was something about its proportions and details that seemed somehow wrong, as if it had been designed by someone who understood conventional automotive design, but had deliberately chosen to ignore certain rules. "That's a 1967 Ford GT40, Victoria said quietly. "One of only 31 road cars ever built." Marcus felt his breath catch as he processed the significance of what he was looking at. The GT40 was automotive legend, a car developed specifically to beat Ferrari at Le Mans, and one of the most successful racing machines in history. But the road-going versions were so rare that most people would never see one outside of a museum. "How much is something like that worth?" Sophie asked in a whisper. "More than most people's houses," Victoria replied. "But the important thing isn't the value. It's the fact that this car represents one of the greatest achievements in American automotive history." They joined the crowd gathered around the GT40, listening as the owner explained the car's provenance and restoration history. Marcus found himself studying not just the car itself, but the reactions of the people around him. There was a reverence in the way they looked at the machine that went far beyond simple admiration for an expensive object. "This is what we're really doing at Chase Automotive," Victoria said quietly as they stepped away from the crowd. "We're not just fixing cars. We're preserving pieces of history. Every project we complete is another chapter in the ongoing story of automotive culture." The morning continued with more introductions and conversations that helped Marcus understand the broader context of his new career. He met restoration specialists who had spent decades perfecting obscure techniques, collectors who had traveled the world searching for specific vehicles, and enthusiasts who could discuss the minutest details of automotive history with scholarly precision. But it was a conversation with a younger collector that provided the most insight into the direction the industry was heading. David Chun, a tech entrepreneur who looked to be about Marcus's age, had assembled an impressive collection of modern supercars and was beginning to branch out into classic vehicles. "The interesting thing about this hobby," Chun explained as they examined his McLaren 720S, "is that it's becoming increasingly democratic. You don't have to be born into wealth to participate anymore. If you have skill and passion, there are opportunities to be involved at every level." Marcus nodded, thinking about his own unexpected entry into this world. But surely the barrier to entry is still pretty high. These cars cost more than most people make in years. "True," Chun agreed. "But there are ways to be involved that don't require owning the cars yourself. The restoration industry, racing support, even specialized photography and documentation. The key is finding your niche and becoming genuinely expert in that area." As they prepared to leave the event, Marcus found himself thinking about Chun's words and their implications for his own future. He had always assumed that the world of exotic cars was fundamentally separate from his own experience, accessible only to people who had been born into privilege or had achieved extraordinary financial success. But spending the morning among these collectors and enthusiasts had revealed a more complex reality. While ownership of the most significant cars was indeed limited to a select few, the culture surrounding them was more inclusive than he had expected. Expertise and passion were valued regardless of their source, and there were opportunities for skilled professionals to build meaningful careers within this specialized world. Victoria seemed to sense his contemplative mood as they walked back toward the parking area. "What did you think?" she asked. "It's different than I expected," Marcus said honestly. "I thought it would be more about showing off wealth, but most of the people we talked to were genuinely knowledgeable and passionate about the cars themselves." "The serious collectors are usually like that," Victoria agreed. "They're not buying cars as trophies. They're preserving automotive history. And that creates opportunities for people who understand that the cars are more important than the status they represent." Sophie had been unusually quiet during the walk back to their truck, but as they reached the parking area, she turned to Victoria with a question that surprised both adults. "Do you think there will still be cars like this when I'm old enough to drive?" Victoria considered the question seriously before answering. "The automotive world is changing rapidly," she said. "Electric vehicles are becoming more common, and autonomous driving technology is advancing quickly. But I think there will always be people who appreciate the art and engineering of these machines, regardless of how transportation technology evolves. Like how people still ride horses even though we have cars?" Sophie asked. "Exactly like that," Victoria said with a smile. "These cars represent something that can't be replicated by modern technology. They're mechanical art, and art doesn't become obsolete." The drive home gave Marcus time to process everything he had experienced that morning. The Cars and Coffee event had provided more than just entertainment. It had given him insight into the culture and values of the world he was entering. The serious collectors weren't just wealthy enthusiasts. They were custodians of automotive history, People who understood that their role extended beyond simple ownership. More importantly, the morning had helped him understand Victoria's motivation for building Chase Automotive. She wasn't just running a business. She was creating an institution dedicated to preserving automotive culture for future generations. Every restoration project was part of that larger mission, and every team member was contributing to something more significant than their individual roles might suggest. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Marcus found himself sitting on their small balcony and thinking about the trajectory his life had taken over the past week. 7 days ago, he had been a struggling independent contractor worried about paying the bills and providing for his daughter's future. Tonight, he was part of a team working on some of the most significant automobiles in the world. But the change went deeper than just professional advancement. The morning at Cars and Coffee had shown him a community of people who shared his appreciation for mechanical precision and historical preservation. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged somewhere beyond his immediate family responsibilities. His phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Thanks for coming this morning. I hope you and Sophie enjoyed meeting some of our extended community. Looking forward to seeing how the Porsche project develops next week." Marcus typed his response carefully. "We had a wonderful time. Sophie hasn't stopped talking about the GT40. Thanks for including us in your world." Victoria's reply came quickly. "It's not my world anymore. It's ours." The simple statement carried implications that Marcus wasn't entirely sure how to interpret, but the warmth it conveyed was unmistakable. He was beginning to realize that his relationship with Victoria was evolving beyond the straightforward employer-employee dynamic he had expected. Monday morning brought a new challenge that would test both Marcus's technical skills and his ability to navigate the complex personalities that populated the exotic car world. A client had arrived unannounced with a 2018 McLaren 720S that was experiencing intermittent electrical problems that had stumped 2 other shops. The client, Richard Blackwood, was a prominent venture capitalist who projected the kind of aggressive confidence that had made him successful in the technology industry, but wasn't necessarily helpful when dealing with mechanical problems. He stood beside his disabled McLaren with the expression of someone who's accustomed to solving problems through force of will and unlimited resources. "I've had this car to McLaren Beverly Hills twice," Blackwood explained to Victoria and Marcus as they examined the vehicle. "They've replaced the entire electrical harness, updated all the software, and charged me $30,000. The problem is still there." Marcus walked around the McLaren slowly, noting the subtle signs of previous work and trying to understand what he was dealing with. The car was essentially new, with fewer than 5,000 miles on the odometer, but something about its electrical behavior was clearly inconsistent with normal operation. "What exactly happens when the problem occurs?" Marcus asked. Blackwood's expression suggested that he wasn't accustomed to being questioned by technicians. "The car just shuts down," he said impatiently. "One minute everything is fine. The next minute it's like someone turned off a switch. No warning, no error codes, just dead." Victoria stepped in smoothly. "Marcus is our lead diagnostic technician," she said. "He specializes in solving the problems that other shops can't figure out. If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to give him a chance to examine the car more thoroughly." Blackwood looked from Victoria to Marcus with obvious skepticism. "How long will that take?" "That depends on what we find," Marcus said honestly. "But I can tell you that intermittent electrical problems are often caused by connections rather than components. If the dealer has been replacing parts without diagnosing the actual failure point, they might be missing something simple." "Simple?" Blackwood's voice carried a note of disbelief. "This car has more computing power than most offices." "Nothing about it is simple," Marcus nodded patiently. "You're absolutely right about the complexity. But complex systems often fail for basic reasons. A loose connection can cause exactly the symptoms you're describing. regardless of how sophisticated the overall system might be. Victoria watched the interaction with interest, recognizing that Marcus was demonstrating exactly the kind of diagnostic thinking that had convinced her to hire him. Rather than being intimidated by the car's complexity or the client's attitude, he was approaching the problem systematically and logically. "What do you need to properly diagnose this?" she asked. "Time and access to the car's diagnostic systems," Marcus replied. "If Mr. Blackwood can leave the car with us for a few days, I think we can figure out what's really going on." Blackwood looked frustrated by the suggestion. "I need the car this weekend. I'm driving it to Monterey for Car Week." Marcus considered this constraint carefully. Monterey Car Week was one of the most important events in the automotive calendar, and Blackwood clearly intended to use his McLaren as both transportation and social currency during the festivities. "I understand the timeline," Marcus said. "But if we're going to solve this problem permanently, we need to do more than just replace parts and hope for the best. Give me until Wednesday, and I'll have an answer for you." The negotiation concluded with Blackwood reluctantly agreeing to leave the car for 3 days, though his body language made it clear that he considered this an imposition rather than a necessary diagnostic procedure. After Blackwood left, Victoria joined Marcus in the work bay, where the McLaren was positioned for inspection. "That was well handled," she said. "Clients like Blackwood are used to getting their way through intimidation. It's important that they understand we're not going to compromise our diagnostic process just because they're impatient." Marcus was already beginning his systematic examination of the car's electrical systems, starting with the most basic connections and working his way toward more complex components. "The challenge with intermittent problems is that they usually don't happen when you want them to," he said. "We need to create conditions that will make the failure occur predictably." The next 3 days became an intensive education in modern automotive electronics for Marcus. The McLaren's electrical architecture was extraordinarily sophisticated, with multiple computer modules communicating through high-speed data, NETWORKS, and controlling everything from engine management to suspension settings. But as Marcus dove deeper into the system, he began to suspect that the problem might be more fundamental than anyone had realized. The symptoms Blackwood described suggested a failure in the car's main power distribution, but the previous shops had focused on replacing components rather than examining the basic infrastructure that supported them. On Tuesday afternoon, Marcus made a discovery that confirmed his suspicions. While examining the main battery connections, he found evidence of corrosion that had been partially cleaned but not completely eliminated. The corrosion was subtle enough to maintain normal operation most of the time, but severe enough to cause intermittent power interruptions under specific conditions. "Look at this," Marcus said, calling Victoria over to examine his findings. Someone cleaned the terminals, but they didn't address the underlying corrosion in the cable itself. When the car experiences high electrical loads, the resistance increases enough to cause voltage drop that triggers the shutdown sequence. Victoria examined the corroded cable carefully. "So the car is actually protecting itself by shutting down when it detects unstable power?" "Exactly," Marcus said. "The safety systems are working perfectly. The problem is that the power supply isn't reliable enough to meet the system's requirements." The solution was relatively straightforward once the actual problem had been identified. Replacing the corroded cable and properly preparing all the connections eliminated the intermittent voltage drop that had been triggering the shutdown sequence. But the real test came when Marcus had to demonstrate the repair to Blackwood, who arrived Wednesday afternoon with the expectation that his expensive car had been fixed through equally expensive procedures. "You replaced a cable?" Blackwood asked incredulously when Marcus explained the repair. "That's it?" "That's it," Marcus confirmed. The cable was corroded internally, creating intermittent resistance that caused voltage fluctuations. When the car's safety systems detected those fluctuations, they shut down the vehicle to prevent potential damage. Blackwood looked from Marcus to Victoria with obvious confusion. But McLaren Beverly Hills said they checked all the connections. They probably checked the terminals, Marcus explained patiently. But internal cable corrosion isn't visible from the outside. You have to test the electrical continuity under load to detect this kind of problem. Victoria stepped in to provide additional context. This is exactly why we approach diagnostics differently than most shops. Rather than replacing components, based on symptoms, we test the entire system to understand what's actually failing. The proof came when Blackwood drove the car for 20 minutes under conditions that had previously triggered the shutdown. The McLaren performed flawlessly, responding with the instant throttle response and seamless power delivery that had made it famous. "How much do I owe you?" Blackwood asked as he prepared to leave. "For the diagnostic time and cable replacement." $800, Victoria said. Blackwood stared at her in disbelief. $800? McLaren charged me $30,000 and didn't fix anything. That's the difference between replacing parts and solving problems, Marcus said. Sometimes the simplest solution is the right solution. As Blackwood drove away in his properly functioning McLaren, Victoria turned to Marcus with a smile that contained both admiration and something deeper. "That was impressive," she said. "You just solved in 3 days what 2 other shops couldn't figure out in months." Marcus felt a familiar satisfaction that came from successfully diagnosing a complex problem, but it was enhanced by the knowledge that he had done it under pressure and in front of people who understood the significance of his achievement. "It's the same process I've always used," he said. "Start with the basics, test everything systematically, and don't assume that expensive means complicated." That evening, as Marcus drove home through the usual Bay Area traffic, he found himself reflecting on how much his confidence had grown in just 2 weeks. The McLaren diagnosis had been challenging, but it had also confirmed that his fundamental approach to problem solving was exactly what Victoria's business needed. More importantly, it had shown him that he could hold his own in a world where technical expertise was valued above credentials or social connections. The satisfaction he felt wasn't just about solving a difficult problem. It was about proving to himself that he belonged in this new environment. Sophie was waiting for him, with homework spread across the kitchen table and a dozen questions about his day. As he described the McLaren diagnosis and repair, Marcus watched his daughter's eyes light up with the same excitement he had felt when he identified the real source of the electrical problem. "So you fixed a car that other people couldn't fix?" Sophie asked. "I figured out what was actually wrong instead of just guessing," Marcus corrected. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't fixing the problem. It's understanding what the problem really is." Sophie nodded seriously. "Like when my math homework doesn't make sense, but then I realize I misunderstood the question?" "Exactly like that," Marcus said, impressed once again by his daughter's ability to find parallels between complex adult situations and her own experience. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Marcus received a call from Victoria that surprised him with its personal rather than professional tone. "I wanted to thank you for today," she said. "Not just for solving the McLaren problem, but for how you handled Blackwood. He's not an easy client, and you managed to educate him without making him feel stupid. He just needed to understand what was actually happening," Marcus said. "Most people are reasonable once they have accurate information." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something personal?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken slightly. "Sure. Do you ever miss your old work? The variety, the independence, the direct relationships with clients who really needed your help." The question caught Marcus off guard, partly because it touched on something he had been thinking about, but hadn't fully articulated to himself. "Sometimes," he said honestly, "there was something satisfying about helping people solve problems they couldn't afford to ignore. But I'm learning that what we do at Chase Automotive is really the same thing on a different scale." "How do you mean?" Marcus considered his words carefully. People like Blackwood aren't just buying car repairs. They're buying peace of mind, expertise, and the confidence that their investments are being properly cared for. It's the same fundamental service, just with different stakes and different clients. I'm glad you see it that way, Victoria said. And Marcus could hear something like relief in her voice. I was worried that you might find this world too removed from the kind of work that originally motivated you. It's different, Marcus admitted. But different doesn't necessarily mean worse, and the technical challenges are incredible. I'm learning more in 2 weeks here than I learned in 2 years on my own. After the call ended, Marcus sat in his kitchen for a while, thinking about Victoria's question and his response to it. The truth was more complex than he had been able to articulate during their conversation. He did miss certain aspects of his old work, particularly the immediacy of helping people solve urgent problems that affected their daily lives. But he was also discovering satisfactions in his new role that he hadn't expected. The intellectual challenges, the collaborative environment, and the opportunity to work on truly exceptional machines were all rewarding in ways that his previous experience hadn't prepared him for. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that his new position offered something his old work never could: the opportunity to build something lasting. Every car they restored at Chase Automotive would outlive everyone currently working on it, carrying forward the knowledge and craftsmanship that went into its preservation. As he prepared for bed, Marcus found himself looking forward to tomorrow's challenges with an enthusiasm that felt both familiar and entirely new. For the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly the work he was meant to do. The realization was both exhilarating and slightly terrifying, because it meant that he had something significant to lose. But as he thought about Sophie's excitement when he described his work, Victoria's confidence in his abilities, and his own growing sense of purpose, Marcus decided that some risks were worth taking. Some opportunities were worth everything. The emergency call came at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, piercing through the quiet of Marcus's apartment, with the kind of urgency that made his heart race before he was fully awake. Victoria's name appeared on his phone screen, and he answered immediately, knowing that she wouldn't call at this hour unless something serious had happened. Marcus, I'm sorry to wake you, but I need your help. Victoria's voice was tight with controlled panic. There's been a fire at the shop. Marcus was already reaching for his clothes before the words fully registered. How bad? Bad enough. The fire department has it contained, but the main workshop took significant damage. More importantly, we had 3 client cars in there, including the Carrera RS you've been working on. The drive to Sausalito felt like it took hours, though Marcus's truck clock showed he made it in 25 minutes. The acrid smell of smoke hung in the air long before he reached the facility, and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles painted the normally serene hillside in harsh reds and blues. Victoria stood in the parking area surrounded by firefighters and insurance investigators, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of stress and exhaustion. When she saw Marcus approaching, her expression shifted to something that looked like relief mixed with desperation. "Thank God you're here," she said, walking quickly to meet him. "I need someone I trust to assess the mechanical damage. The fire chief says it was an electrical fault in the main panel, but the smoke and water damage extends throughout the building." Marcus surveyed the scene with growing dismay. The main workshop, which had been pristine and perfectly organized just hours earlier, now looked like a war zone. Smoke stains darkened the walls, pools of water covered the polished concrete floors, and the acrid smell of burned electronics permeated everything. But it was the sight of the damaged cars that made his stomach clench with genuine anguish. The Porsche Carrera RS sat partially covered by a fire suppression tarp, its freshly rebuilt engine exposed and vulnerable to the contaminated environment. Water had pooled in the engine bay, and soot-covered surfaces that had been meticulously cleaned and prepared. "The insurance adjuster will be here in the morning," Victoria said, following his gaze toward the Porsche. "But I need to know how bad the actual damage is before I call the clients. Some of these cars are irreplaceable." Marcus moved through the damaged workshop methodically, documenting what he saw and trying to separate repairable damage from genuine disaster. The fire itself had been contained quickly enough to prevent total destruction, but smoke and water had contaminated everything in the main work area. "The good news is that most of this looks worse than it actually is," Marcus said after completing his initial assessment. "The cars are dirty and wet, but I don't see any fire damage to the vehicles themselves. The bad news is that we're looking at weeks of cleaning and decontamination before we can even assess the mechanical systems properly." Victoria nodded, but Marcus could see that she was struggling to maintain her professional composure. "The worst part is the timing," she said. "We have 3 major projects that were supposed to be completed in the next month, including the Porsche for that racing event. The clients are going to be devastated." Over the next several hours, as dawn broke over the bay and the immediate crisis atmosphere began to settle into the grimmer reality of recovery planning, Marcus found himself taking on a role he hadn't expected. Victoria was clearly overwhelmed by the scope of the disaster and the complexity of dealing with insurance companies, client relations, and facilities restoration simultaneously. "What if we set up temporary operations?" Marcus suggested as they sat in Victoria's office, which had escaped the worst of the damage. "We could rent space somewhere, move the essential equipment, and continue working on the projects that can be salvaged." Victoria looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Do you think that's actually possible?" "The insurance company is talking about months of investigation and remediation." "The investigation doesn't have to stop us from working," Marcus said. "We document everything, photograph all the damage, but then we focus on moving forward. The longer these cars sit in contaminated air, the worse the damage is going to get." What followed was 3 days of the most intensive work Marcus had ever undertaken. Working with Rodriguez Chun and the rest of the Chase Automotive team, he coordinated the careful removal of client vehicles from the damaged facility and their transport to a temporary workshop space they had hastily arranged in an industrial area of San Rafael. The temporary facility was a far cry from the sophisticated environment they had lost. Instead of climate-controlled perfection, they had a basic garage space with adequate lighting and ventilation, but none of the specialized equipment that made complex restoration work possible. But Marcus discovered that the team's expertise was more adaptable than anyone had realized. Rodriguez managed to set up a makeshift paint booth using portable equipment and careful environmental controls. Chun created a mobile electronics diagnostic station that could handle most of the computer-related issues they encountered. Martinez established an upholstery workspace that was functional if not elegant. Most importantly, the temporary situation seemed to bring out a level of creativity and collaboration that had been less necessary in their previous well-equipped environment. Without unlimited resources, everyone had to think more carefully about processes and priorities. "This is like the old days," Rodriguez commented as they worked on cleaning smoke residue from the Porsche's interior components. "When I was starting out, we had to make everything work with whatever we could find or build ourselves." The client reactions to the fire were mixed, but generally more understanding than Victoria had feared. Morrison, the owner of the Carrera RS, was philosophical about the delay and impressed by the team's efforts to minimize damage and continue working despite the circumstances. "These things happen," he said when he visited the temporary facility to assess the situation. "What matters is how you respond to the crisis. From what I can see, you're handling this exactly right." But it was Richard Blackwood's reaction that surprised everyone. When he learned about the fire and the temporary relocation, his response wasn't anger or demands for compensation. Instead, He showed up at the temporary facility with a truck full of equipment and an offer to help however he could. I know what it's like to have everything you've built threatened by circumstances beyond your control, he explained to Marcus and Victoria. The least I can do is help you get back on your feet. The gesture was particularly meaningful because it came from someone who had initially seemed concerned only with his own convenience. The crisis had revealed character traits that weren't apparent during normal business interactions. As the temporary operations stabilized and work resumed on the various restoration projects, Marcus found himself spending increasing amounts of time working directly with Victoria on the business recovery planning. The fire had created challenges that extended far beyond the immediate physical damage, requiring decisions about insurance claims, client communications, and long-term facility planning. I keep thinking about what you said the first day you came to work, Victoria said one evening as they reviewed insurance documents in her temporarily relocated office. About how some things are more important than money. I'm starting to understand what you meant. Marcus looked up from the spreadsheet he was reviewing. How do you mean? The fire could have destroyed everything I've built over the past 10 years, Victoria said. But what I've discovered is that the real value of this business isn't in the building or the equipment. It's in the relationships with clients and the expertise of people like you and the rest of the team. She paused, looking out the window toward the bay where the lights of San Francisco were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. When I started this company, I thought success meant having the most sophisticated facility and the most expensive equipment. But the last few weeks have shown me that what really matters is having people who care about the work and who are willing to do whatever it takes to solve problems. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that Victoria was sharing something deeper than professional observations. You've built something remarkable here, he said. The fire was devastating, but it also proved that what you created is stronger than any individual component. The conversation was interrupted by Sophie's arrival at the temporary facility. Marcus had been working late most evenings since the fire, and Sophie had started coming by after school to do her homework in the makeshift office space rather than going home to an empty apartment. How's the Porsche coming along? She asked, settling into a chair with her math textbook. Better than expected, Marcus said. We should have it running again by next week, and it might even be ready for Mr. Morrison's racing event, after all. Sophie smiled with the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing problems solved through persistence and hard work. I'm glad everything worked out. Victoria watched the interaction between Marcus and his daughter with an expression that seemed to contain several layers of emotion. Sophie, can I ask you something? Sure. What do you think about the possibility of your dad and me working together for a long time? I mean, after we get the permanent facility rebuilt and everything is back to normal? Sophie considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. I think Dad is happier here than he's been in a long time, she said finally. And I think you need someone who cares about fixing things the right way, not just the expensive way. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion at his daughter's simple but perceptive assessment of the situation. She had identified something that he was still learning to articulate, that his relationship with Victoria and Chase Automotive had evolved beyond a simple employment arrangement into something more collaborative and meaningful. What about you? Victoria asked Sophie. How would you feel about being part of our extended family here? Sophie's face lit up with a smile that answered the question before she spoke. I'd like that a lot, especially if it means I get to keep learning about cars and meeting people like Mr. Morrison. That weekend, Marcus and Sophie helped Victoria move equipment back into the renovated main facility. The insurance settlement had funded improvements that made the new workshop even better than the original, with enhanced fire suppression systems, improved workflow organization, and expanded space for future growth. But the most significant change wasn't physical. It was the sense of shared purpose and mutual support that had developed during the crisis period. The team that had worked together to overcome the fire damage was stronger and more cohesive than the group that had existed before the emergency. "I have something I want to discuss with you," Victoria said as they took a break from unpacking equipment. The insurance settlement included funds for business interruption, which means we have the resources to expand our operations significantly. Marcus waited, sensing that Victoria was building towards something important. "I want to offer you a partnership stake in Chase Automotive," she continued. "Not just as an employee, but as a co-owner who has a say in how we grow and develop the business going forward." The offer was so unexpected that Marcus needed a moment to process what Victoria was proposing. Partnership meant not just financial benefits, but genuine ownership and decision-making authority in a business that had already exceeded his highest expectations. "I don't know what to say," Marcus said honestly. "This is incredibly generous, but I'm not sure I've earned that level of responsibility." Victoria shook her head. "You've already proven that you understand what this business is really about. During the crisis, you didn't just solve technical problems. You helped preserve relationships and maintain our reputation with clients. That's exactly the kind of partnership I need to take Chase Automotive to the next level." Over the following weeks, as the legal details of the partnership were worked out and the facility renovation was completed, Marcus found himself thinking about how dramatically his life had changed since that rainy night when he had stopped to help a stranded motorist. The decision to offer assistance had seemed simple at the time, motivated by basic human decency, rather than any expectation of reward. But that moment of kindness had opened doors to opportunities he couldn't have imagined and relationships that had fundamentally altered his understanding of what was possible. Victoria had seen something in his approach to problem-solving that she valued enough to share her life's work with him. The partnership celebration was held at the newly renovated facility on a perfect California evening with clients, team members, and industry colleagues gathering to mark both the recovery from the fire and the beginning of a new chapter for Chase Automotive. Sophie moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, discussing automotive history with collectors who treated her opinions with genuine respect. "You know what I realized today?" Victoria said as she and Marcus stood together watching the celebration unfold around them. "What's that?" "The night we met, when you fixed my car, I thought I was the one doing you a favor by offering you work," Victoria said. "But it turned out to be the other way around. You gave me something I didn't even know I was missing." Marcus looked at her questioningly. "A partner who understands that the work itself is more important than any individual project," Victoria explained. "Someone who sees these cars the way I do, as pieces of history that deserve to be preserved and appreciated." As the evening wound down and the guests gradually departed, Marcus found himself standing in the main workshop, surrounded by the cars they had saved and restored. The Porsche Carrera RS gleamed under the LED lighting, ready for its return to the racing circuit where it belonged. The McLaren projects sparkled with the perfection that came from obsessive attention to detail. Every vehicle represented not just mechanical achievement, but the preservation of automotive culture for future generations. "Dad, are you ready to go home?" Sophie asked, appearing at his side with her jacket and backpack. Marcus looked around the workshop one more time, taking in the sophisticated equipment, the climate-controlled environment, and the sense of purpose that permeated everything they had built together. "Actually," he said, "I think we are home." Victoria joined them, and for a moment, the three of them stood together in comfortable silence, surrounded by the mechanical art that had brought them together and would continue to connect them to something larger than themselves. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that none of them could have imagined just months earlier. There would be new challenges, difficult projects, and demanding clients. But there would also be the satisfaction of preserving automotive history, the joy of solving complex problems, and the knowledge that expertise and integrity could create opportunities that transcended any individual circumstances. As they turned off the lights and locked the facility for the night, Marcus realized that he had found something rarer than any exotic car, a place where his skills were valued, his contributions mattered, and his daughter could grow up understanding that kindness and competence could open doors to extraordinary worlds. The drive home through the quiet streets of Marin County felt different now. This wasn't just where Marcus lived. It was where he belonged, part of a community that appreciated craftsmanship and supported those who dedicated themselves to excellence. And somewhere in the distance, the lights of San Francisco sparkled across the bay like promises of all the adventures that lay ahead for a man who had discovered that helping others was the surest path to helping himself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.